And we're live. Anine, welcome. Thank you for those that are attending live, and for those of you watching the replay at home, thank you as well. This is our Strawberry Moon June session for the Rama Survive-a-Rama, Rama Land Stewardship Guild. And yeah, tonight Caleb's going to be sharing some teachings around the Strawberry Moon. And we're going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into the ecology of Turtle Island and the specific habitats you can find around here in the Eastern Woodlands. And I think those two topics are going to really meld together in quite a beautiful way. So I'm going to leave it there and pass it over to Caleb to kick us off tonight. And then, yeah, I'll be back on in a little bit. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Anin, bonjour, everybody. And those watching the recording, because we only got 2 attendees tonight, but we're going to still treat it like this is a big deal because it's Survive-a-Rama. Congratulations, folks, into surviving into another moon, into another month. We are in Ode'imin Giizis. Ode'imin is what we now refer to as the strawberry. Ode'imin has a few ways of translation. You could simply just say strawberry and you'd be fine with that. Most people these days would understand that. But if we dive deeper into what Ode'imin's talking about, min is always talking about a fruiting body. So that could be a seed like monomen or wild rice. It could be talking about a nut, which is like something like matigamin, which is an acorn. It could be talking about a fruit that is a stone fruit like a plum or a wild peach, things like that. I currently forget the name for American wild plum and Canada wild plum right now in my head, but examples of that. It could be something like an apple, mishim min. That min is in there again. And then in this case, berries or smaller fruits, which are a whole other taxonomy and arguments of what is a berry and what isn't a berry. Ode'imin, that strawberry technically isn't a berry because the seeds are on the outside of the fruiting body. So it's actually technically not a berry, but in our language and our taxonomy, it's still min, the fruiting body of a plant. That's all min really is describing in that sense. Ode, a lot of people will just directly translate to heart because I have ode here, right? That's ode. And then you hear that word ode in Ode'imin, and people go heartberry. And it does look a little bit like the human heart or an animal's heart, especially the wild strawberries. They look very similar. But if you cut any berry in half, it often looks like the classical Valentine's Day heart. It's got that little bump, set of bumps at the top going down to a point. That is a heart. So you could say it in that way. But Ode'imin isn't really describing a heart, though it's still a correct translation. That's the beauty of Anishinaabemowin is there's layers to it, so many layers to it. Ode is also heard in another term that many of us learned when we were in Ojibwe language classes in school. Odenong. Odenong is talking about a town. Well, that's not a heart. So why are we calling a town Odenong? Well, what it is a hub. And what that's talking about is the concept of what a hub is. So a town is where all the roads go to. All those lanes, all those streets, all those highways, all those roads lead to a town. And that town is the hub of all of those roads. My heart is the hub of my entire circulatory system. All my veins and all my arteries are connected to that. And that pump moves that blood through my system like cars on the roads. Strawberry plants and their fruit are both hubs because that fruit, as we said, has all the seeds on the outside. They're attached to that one place, right? One place. If you look at um, Musquaman, which is some people describe as raspberries. Give me 1 second. Uh, when it comes down to something like a raspberry, Musquaman, we're talking about, all those different compartments that each have one or two individual seeds inside of it. And each one of those little bugles are, yeah, bugles is the proper term for that. Whereas with a strawberry, they're all connected to one hub. So that's one way of understanding Ode'imin. The other way of understanding Ode'imin is if you look at a strawberry plant. Strawberry plants aren't just one little bush like a raspberry bush or a blueberry bush or a cranberry bush. high bush cranberry in that particular situation. The low bush cranberry is actually like a creeping vine. But anyways, it's vines that, or what's sometimes referred to as runners, that are basically an above ground rhizome. Rhizomes are below surface stems or vines, if you want to think of it that way. Runners are often what's referred to as an above ground or above surface rhizome. Definitions get confusing. Don't worry about it. If the plant has one set of roots here with a bunch of leaves and it shoots out over here and does it again, it's running to the next spot. Therefore, it's a runner. Easy to remember. Don't worry about the rhizome and all the other definitions. But they all, if you find the end of a strawberry plant and you follow it back, you'll see others going to the same place. And each of those little places are an ode, a hub, a spot of contact where everything leads back to. And so in the name, it's having all these concepts to understand what this plant is. And that has a lot of teachings in Anishinaabe culture. We talk about the strawberry as a teaching of kindness and a teaching of forgiveness, including self-forgiveness and self-kindness, because of how that strawberry in our traditional teachings came into being. I don't want to go too deep into the strawberry teachings on this call, because I would rather do that one in person when we're talking about strawberries. But it's basically a teaching of two young brothers would always horseplay and play rough, and one of them dies by accident. And the brother who survives feels so much guilt and shame. He hides the body, buries his brother, and then keeps returning back and recurring back to the gravesite with guilt about what happened. And then one day, after picking all the plants, he knows a new plant that he'd never seen before coming out. Later on, that plant formed a white to green fruit, and that started to turn red. And when it was red and ripe, the plant said, "Eat me." And when he ate it, he felt his brother's love. That's like the Reader's Digest, really condensed version of the story. And that love is that kindness and forgiveness of family. For the brother knew it wasn't intentional and it wasn't your fault, and all those beautiful concepts of forgiveness and kindness. We have those teachings in the strawberry, but we also have just simply the teachings of community. That plant, first and foremost, is all interconnected to other so-called plants. They're actually basically just extensions of the plant through a above surface rhizome or a runner, but they in our teachings are looking as if they are different plants that are all helping each other and supporting one another. Now, the ecology of strawberries is really fascinating. Both the wild and the domesticated strawberries are what we refer to as allelopathic. Allelopathic plants are something that's a little bit misunderstood, and people think that allelopathic plants kill everything around them. Like black walnuts are often described as allelopathic, and they will warn you to never plant anything underneath a black walnut, for it will never survive. I can call shenanigans on that, because I have to weed around all my black walnut trees all the time of all the invasive plants that can grow around them. There's entire ecosystems that depend on black walnut as the keystone canopy tree. And we'll be getting into ecology later with Chris later in the call. But we really want to remember that allelopathy is a little bit misunderstood by the common folk and most people in general. Biologists and ecologists and botanists really understand what allelopathic is. Basically, the plant can do one of two things when it's allelopathic. It produces chemicals in the soil. Sorry, my computer just froze on me for a second. There we go. Can you still hear me, Chris?
Yep, you're good, man.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. My computers did something very strange and shut off for half a second.
Everything's fine on this end.
Okay, good. So allelopathic plants can do one of two things. First off, they can produce basically chemicals in their roots that gets exposed into the soil around them that can do one of two things. First, it can make the soil more advantageous to its species. Something like purging buckthorn, which is a very aggressive invasive species in my region and many regions of Ontario, does just that. It really loves to make chemicals in the soil that benefits it and its neighboring buckthorn plants, buckthorn trees. And that makes it more advantage, gives them a greater advantage, which allows them to outcompete other species. So that's one way that allelopathic plants can work, is it gives themselves a boost. The other direction is it can create harmful chemicals in the soil that harm other species and sometimes themselves. And that's where strawberry gets fascinating. So maybe you've grown strawberries in your garden. And most people who know much about growing domestic strawberries or wild strawberries, they know that A, it takes several years before the strawberry bushes or strawberry plants start to actually produce consistent fruit. It takes them a few years. They're a perennial plant. They don't just, you plant them like a tomato and they start shooting out a bunch of strawberries, unless you get something like an ever-bearing cultivar or something like that. So first off, takes a few years, and then after about 7 to 10 years, depending on the cultivar, the production actually drops. It actually starts to go down. And what's happening there is the plant has created allelopathic compounds in the soil to outcompete a lot of other species that could otherwise shade it out because they grow along the surface of the ground. And so that allelopathic chemical helps compete out and kill off other plants around them. But once that chemical is in the ground and has killed off all the other plants around it, the strawberry still produces the chemical. And it continues to produce the chemical and produce the chemical and produce the chemical and produce the chemical until the chemical gets turned on itself and it starts to die off. The name in English for this plant is strawberry. And that should give you a hint as one plant that you can actually grow it with. Grasses. The wild grasses, the native grasses of North America and Eurasia, can handle the chemicals that are put out by strawberry. They also don't overshade them. And most importantly, it will continue to absorb that allelopathic chemical from the strawberry. That's why you can find fields of wild strawberries or fields of domesticated strawberries that have gone feral that just keep producing since your childhood. And you're like, but when I grow it in my garden, it doesn't work because they're growing with the grass and the grass can handle those chemicals. So there's some like really interesting ecology about the strawberry itself. So that's why this time of year is referred to as Ode'imin Giizis, the strawberry moon. Strawberry is one of the first fruiting bodies of the year that we can consume other than certain fungi. Uh, mushrooms are a fruiting body of the fungi kingdom. Berries, fruit in general, are the fruiting bodies, seeds and such of plants. So the first fruiting body of the year that we can pick is often things like morels and other certain wild fungi, dryad, saddler, pheasant's back, all that. One of the first plant fruiting bodies that we can consume is strawberry, Ode'imin. And so this is the time of year that you start to see Ode'imin out on the landscape. They flowered in early May and they've been producing their berry for a few months now, getting it grown and developed. And now we're getting into that time. And actually, we're almost near the end of June, so we're actually almost halfway in to uh, Ode'imin Giizis. And so we have these strawberries out on the landscape that we can pick, consume, and enjoy. That's the first reason we name it that. But it's also because, again, we talk about semiology all the time in these calls and in this program of Survive-a-Rama. Strawberries are an indicator of stuff. They are going to fruit when certain conditions in the soil are right, humidity in the air, temperature of the soil, temperature of the air, water content, all those kinds of things. And all of that ties into something else, tree bark. Again, semiology doesn't always make sense. It's not a straight this to this, but they're both reacting to the same things. Chris will often talk about spring peepers, usually around the same time calling as the smelts start to migrate up the streams to breed. They have nothing to do with each other, but they're both waiting for certain temperatures of water. That's the teaching. That's the reading that we get from seeing strawberries. I know that 80% of the tree barks that I could be peeling are going to peel best after the strawberries fruit and will be at their peak of peeling when the strawberry is ripe, right? It goes from popping and being, greenish white little berry or fruit to red. That's when it's going to be peak bark peeling time. So if I want to get birch bark, we've talked about and done winter bark in previous sessions. We can do that all year round, but to get bark easily without having to use a lot of heat and having to use special tools to really get it off the tree, we go out now. This is like from here, basically the end of May, pretty much, yeah, as soon as those fruiting bodies start to form after the flowers of the strawberry plant are done, you can start to peel the bark off a birch tree pretty easily. Now, though, is when you start to be able to peel basswood, wig up. This is when you can start to peel ash, maple, oak. Most of the trees, they've pumped up all of their sap earlier in the season, and now they're kind of just full of fluids. And when you have this high humidity, high heat, all those kinds of conditions, and they've had a good amount of water. That bark it's not floating on the tree. I don't want to get anybody confused of what's really happening in there, but it's very loose in comparison to the rest of the year. And so you can cut the bark at the bottom of the tree, and then either rip sheets off or strips off the tree for depending on what you want to use the bark for, or you can peel entire sections of bark off of the tree depending on what you want. If I want to make rope, I can just cut an area. Let's say I have a tree about 8 inches in diameter, which would be approximately 12 centimeters, I believe, if my math equations are right in my head. Uh, that 8 inch diameter tree, roughly about 12 centimeters to 13 centimeters. I can go to it and cut a 1 inch wide strip at the bottom, lift it up with my knife, and just pull it all the way up. And that tree will continue to grow and live because I only took a little portion of a big diameter tree, or sorry, big circumference, and I got what I need. And that's often what I'll do is I'll just take a strip off the tree. And that's a very sustainable way to do it. If I need to get a lot of bark for making rope, I might choose to cut down a tree and take all the bark off in that situation. And of course, we're going to look at sustainability practices for that kind of stuff this coming weekend at the in-person session of Survive-a-Rama. We're going to learn how to choose and select and selectively drop those trees if we choose to do so to harvest bark for projects. If I want to get sheets to be able to make baskets, because birch is not the only tree we can make baskets with. No, no, no. Pine bark, cedar bark, basswood bark very easily, maple bark, ash bark. I've even made baskets, little tiny dainty little like dishes out of sumac bark, which is wild because of how thin that bark is. But at the right time of year, it's flexible enough as long as you peel it properly. This is the time of year to peel bark. And when you talk about the Eastern Woodlands, you talk about our ecology as Anishinaabe people in the landscape that we developed on and basically evolved our culture on. We are a tree people. We are a woodland people. We're not on the plains, although we do have prairie ecology. Don't get me wrong. We do have a lot of prairie ecology, and there are plains Anishinaabe, known as the Soto people, who went further west than the rest of us. But the majority of our identity is around trees, whether it's birch bark canoes, birch bark baskets, ash splint baskets, all the way to all the beautiful carvings and bows and all the things we used to make in the old days, and even to this day. We are a tree people. And so when it comes down to trees, bark is a dependent, heavily dependent upon commodity is the words I'm trying to say here. I've been up since Monday. I want to apologize to everybody. I've been fire keeping since Monday night. I'm very sleep deprived, so if I sound incoherent, I do sincerely apologize. There's not enough coffee in the world by this day of the week of fire keeping. Um, but it's a heavily dependent on commodity. Bark is going to be able to make baskets, canoes, lodge coverings, rope, even clothing. When we get into the fall, we're going to be possibly harvesting acorns or at least processing acorns. And to then do that, we need to grind them up into a meal and then put them into a water porous container that allows water to flow through it, but not let the acorn meal float away and let the water wash the tannins away. And how that was done was with bags like this one here, woven out of the bark of certain trees. In this case, this one was made of dogbane fiber, hemp dogbane, but basswood bark was used for that. And several other trees were also used for banking very fine cord to weave fabric. We had fabric. This is fabric. This is not as coarse as muslin or burlap. This is actually quite fine. The Ainu of Japan, who are not Anishinaabe and indigenous to North America, but the Ainu people, the indigenous people of Japan, used to make shirts and pants out of basswood bark fiber. And we're going to show you the beginning of that process this coming weekend. We can make bark canoes out of birch bark, white spruce. Further west, they use pine trees amongst the Klamath people. Elm bark is an incredible material because it's instead of being, vertical grain like cedar bark or horizontal grain like birch bark, it's actually a woven grain. So you can actually bend and contort that bark a lot easier than you can with most other barks. We were a bark people as much as we were a woodland people. We were a bark people. We'd made so many things. We even made cradle boards to carry our babies in out of just a sheet of bark. All the cord we ever used, except for certain plants who we were also using the bark of. They were just a different kind of bark. The bark fibers, the plant fibers came from barks, whether it was plants or trees. So we're a bark people. And that's really the main thing that we want to talk about is the resources of the trees. So this coming weekend, we're going to be using bark to make a few things. We're going to be harvesting other stuff off the trees to make other things. And that's because this is the time of year of resource harvesting. One of the coolest things I ever witnessed was right after a thunderstorm. We cut a tree down, I believe it was a basswood, and it was about 15 minutes after a thunderstorm had gone through, and it was a big thunderstorm. And the tree was felled up a hill. So it fell up like that. Canopy is up here. The butt of the tree was down the hill. Not the safest way to fell a tree, but the elder wanted to demonstrate something. He went up 12 feet up the log, cut the log, rolled the log away from the rest of the tree, still up the hill like that, and kicked it from the uphill side. Kicked the middle of the log, and thump, the log came out of the tube of bark. That's how loose the bark was after a thunderstorm this time of year. Because what happens is all that fluid that's inside of the bark is an electrolyte solution. And what is a thunderstorm? A massive static electrical storm. So it agitates that electrolyte solution and actually makes it a little looser. I've on many occasions walked up to a birch tree 20, 30 minutes after a thunderstorm rolls through, reached up as high as I could and slashed the tree and walked away and got a coffee. Grabbed a coffee, poured a coffee, drank the coffee, came back, and the bark was waiting for me on the ground. That's how magical this time of year is when it comes down to bark harvesting. It is so easy to take the bark off right now compared to the rest of the time of year. The rest of the year, this is the time of year you want to learn how to peel bark. It's so effortless. With certain species, it's even that removal of the bark that's important. When we take the bark off a tree, I want you to touch that wood. It's ice cold. Even on the hottest day, it's ice cold. When we would peel bark as my crew, as my friends and I would do when we were working on building wigwams, we would be taking off big sheets of bark from hickory trees and basswood trees and cedar trees. We would actually sit on the logs right after we peeled them to cool down because it felt like you were sitting on a block of ice. It's an incredibly cold sensation, very, very refreshing, very relieving of the heat of the day, especially all the work to get the bark off of a big tree. But there's another use to that. Basswood, for example, we go up when we take that bark off the tree. You can lay that bark out in the field overnight, and you lay it out with the outer bark facing down, so it becomes almost like a trough, right? Because you take the bark off the tree, and it kind of wants to stay looking like a gutter. So you lay it like that on the grass. The next morning, before the sun gets high, you go in there and you go and collect it, and you'll see this kind of clear jelly slime on the inside of the bark. The dew of nighttime leached out all this gunk and you scrape it. I'm making it sound very appetizing. I know it sounds unappealing when I'm describing it as gunk and goo and slime, but you would scrape it with a wooden spatula or a stick, a sharpened, flattened stick, into a cook pot, like the one I have in this bag. And you would add to that bone broth from venison broth or a moose bones, beaver bones, bear bones, whatever you had around, and you would cook it together, and you would have a complete meal that was in liquid form. You could take that slime, that clear slime, and smear it on a birch bark sheet and leave it in the sun to dry, and then crush it up and break it off and shatter it up and grind that into powder and put that into a waterproof container and carry it. And then when it was time to feed your baby or feed an elder that has no teeth, you add that powder to the bone broth. And it has all the complex carbohydrates the body needs, all the proteins the body needs from the venison broth or the bone broth, all the fats the body needs from the bone broth, all the lipids, all the riboflavin, all that kind of stuff that you need, all that kind of stuff that you need to actually be able to stay alive. And so if you have a mother who can't breastfeed, this was pablum. This was the formula that we would give to our babies. When you have elders that can't chew because they've lost all their teeth from their age, or you have someone that's infirm, they broke their jaw because they got kicked by a moose when they were in a hunting accident, whatever it may be, or they fell and they injured themselves and they can't chew anymore, you would be able to pour this and they'd be able to drink it and it would keep them alive. It would feed them, it would nourish them. So like there's more than just taking some bark off to make crafts. There's a lot of layers to it all, just like how there's layers to bark. So That is what Ode'imin Giizis means to me. This is the time of year that I go to get bark, a lot of different types of bark. Basswood bark is one of my main ones, birch bark as well, but I'll even go after, ash bark, maple bark, such to get projects made, to finish crafts, make rattles out of the bark, folded rattles, folded bark rattles, making water containers in the same way, and then sewing or gluing the sides of them together. So many different ways to use the bark, but even to just take care of our children and our elderly and our infirm. That I find is such an important part of what this time of year represents to us. This is the time that that plentifulness begins for the Anishinaabe. From here all the way to September and the end of September, all the food is out there now. You don't have to like preserve and live off the preserved food of the winter anymore. And the maple sugar and a couple leeks and a couple fiddleheads and all that kind of early greens that you can kind of forage and live off of. This is the time of greens, roots, shoots, barks, berries. So many foods are out now. This is when it begins now. So this is when things get really interesting out there in the woods. So with all that said and done, I'm going to stop ranting as a manic person who's heavily caffeinated and heavily sleep deprived. I'm going to pass over to Chris unless we want to take a break or if we have any questions. Maybe we should go with questions first.
Yeah, let's see if there's any questions. Maybe while we're waiting too, I'm curious, Caleb. You said Misquamin for red raspberries.
That's one of the names I've heard. I've heard that also for a few other species as well, though.
Isn't painted turtle a really similar name?
There's a few like we had that talk last summer, didn't we? We were
Yeah,
talking
I
about
was just
turtle
trying to think.
names.
That
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
incredibly similar to turtle to me, and I was trying to think if there's any connection or relation in the words.
Red. Miss Squaw is usually talking about red. And so you will hear it in like Misquaabo, it's talking about blood, the red liquid.
Mm.
But also it's talking about like the abo is talking about how everything comes together because again, veins in the circulatory system. Um, Misquamin is talking about a red fruit. And then
I
you
think is
hear
it
that
Misquatacy? Does that sound right? Misquatacy or something like that?
Misquadesi, I believe, is a
Misquatacy.
painted turtle. I
Yeah.
believe. I'll check my notes to confirm in a moment.
Cool. Maybe there's not a connection. I just had that thought there. It sounded so similar.
But it's definitely about red. Misquadesi is talking like the Misquaw is talking about all the red lines on a painted turtle.
Oh, right. Of course they would have that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. And anyone else have any questions about any of the stuff Caleb was just sharing, or want to pipe in and share anything?
I just wanted to just recap what you said. June, Ode'imin Giizis is when all the food is available, and then you listed a bunch of things: roots, berries, shoots, bark. There was a few other things.
Yeah, so this is like when fruit. So Ode'imin Giizis is the beginning of plentifulness. So it's going to go from now all the way to pretty much October. Is you're going to have that huge influx of life on the land is producing so many options of food. Up until now, there's a couple of shoots and greens that you can eat, and then of course the maple sap and the birch sap and such that you can produce in the sugars. But now it's like fruiting bodies are going to begin. Probably by late July, you're going to start seeing choke cherries that will be available all the way into August, September. You're going to be seeing things like May apples are forming right now, but they won't be ready until the end of August. And May apple, it's a toxic plant, but when you get them at the right time, they're one of my favorite fruit because when they're fully ripened and almost overripe, the toxin goes away from the fruit pulp and the juices of the fruit, and it's so damn delicious. It tastes almost like a golden delicious apple with a little bit of like a lemony taste to it. Chris, how would you describe a May apple fruit? Like
I've never actually had a May apple fruit, so
we are fixing that because there's a ton of May apple on the property. We are fixing that, Chris.
cool. No, I've never had one.
My grandmother every year would make one pie out of May apple because she would only make one because there's still some of the toxins left inside of the fruit, but there's not enough to harm you. So she would make one pie a year. It'd be almost like a apple custard pie. And it was incredible. It's one of my favorite fruit in the Eastern Woodlands. One of my absolute favorites, and they're huge. They're like this big. They get the size of like ping pong balls to small, like a billiard ball. So fruit are beginning now. Shoots of different plants, like the cattail shoots, are still good. You can eat the heart of the cattail still. All those kinds of things. The greens are available as well still, because of course we have things like lamb's quarters from Trinopodium family. All those different kinds of greens. Those almost like spinach and lettuces of the landscape are all around us now. You also have some roots like cattail is very, very easily digestible this time of year because it's so fresh and lively. It's actually creating new shoots that are sometimes referred to as Cossack asparagus. These kind of white shoots that come out on the end from now until September. That is the new growth for next year of the perennial cattail. And you can eat those raw. Like you just chew them up and snap them up, and they're just so easy to digest, and they're so delicious. So you're getting shoots, the bark, of course, as I said earlier, we can peel bark. The inner bark of birch, the inner bark of white pine, the inner bark of poplar, though I find poplar a little too tannic for my liking. But white pine bark, if we can find a white pine on the property, I would love to be able to just take one branch and peel off the outer bark and let you taste how sweet white pine bark cambium is this time of year. Was used all around the world where pines grew as a survival ration by drying it, grinding it, and adding it to flour to extend the longevity of how much food you're going to have. It was a filler that you would add to your flour so you can keep making bread later and later and later into the year with one bag of flour. You just kept adding pine bark to it. The Anishinaabe, we actually have a racial slur against us that is now the name of a mountain range in New York State called Adirondack. It comes from Ratrontak, which is a Mohawk word, which means the bark eaters. They referred to us as bark eaters, and that was like their racial slur for our tribe, for our nation, because if the Minoman failed, we would peel bark and we would live off bark in the winter. If the beaver weren't doing well, if the hunting was bad, and we were up in the mountains of the Adirondacks, the Ratrontak Mountains, the Haudenosaunee would observe those southern Ojibways living off bark. And so they referred to us as bark eaters, which is not offensive to me because I do eat bark, but at the same time, that's not my entire identity. Why would you call me that? So I can see why it's referred to as a slur. Um, but yeah, that's like how far our bark culture is including cuisine. Pine bark is one of my favorites, white pine bark especially because just how sweet it is this time of year. And when you preserve it, it kind of keeps that sweetness. Later in the season, as the bark starts to dry onto the tree again, it becomes very bitter and acrid. Poplar bark, cambium, the inner bark was eaten, but it's very, very, very bitter. I find it, you have to like parboil it a couple of times to wash away those tannins that make it so bitter. And then you can kind of use it, but by then it's very bland. Whereas pine has that nice sweetness to it. Birch, cambium can also be eaten. Again, I find it a little bit tannic, but that's just personally. Some people do like the taste. Then again, some people like really tannic wines, and I prefer a drier sweet wine if I was drinking wine still. All those kinds of concepts can easily be like looked into of like bark. So fruit, shoots, bark, buds of certain plant like flower blossoms are still edible this time of year. We just finished harvesting. There's still some out there as I'm looking outside right now. Black locust blossoms all over my neighborhood, and we turn those into fritters and all kinds of stuff. We're also seeing like the beginning of like the other berries. Raspberries have finished flowering, blueberries have finished flowering, haskaps have finished flowering. The service berries, well over a month ago, finished flowering, and by the end of this month, the end of July, a lot of those will have gone to fruit because July is Mean Giizis, the berry moon. Some people will call it the raspberry moon. Other places they'll call it the blueberry moon. Others will just call it the berry moon. So we're seeing that those flowers forming and finishing and starting to form the fruit. And by the end of next month, July, we'll be prospering in the fruit moon. We'll be eating so many different kinds of wild fruit on the landscape. And then again, there'll be other fruit in August, other fruit in September. I like to pick my choke cherries when they're really, 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 really dark, and that can take sometimes a month on the tree for them to get that dark. My challenge is birds. Birds love choke cherries probably as much, if not more, than I do, and they can eat them a little earlier in the season than we can. And they can eat them throughout that whole time and get to them before I can. The longer you leave certain fruit on the tree, the better they taste. Some fruit like mountain ash are very, very like bitter and acrid, but after they get one or two heavy frosts, they become very sweet. Things like that are happening. Certain fruit are toxic until they're ready to be picked, until they're like, as I was saying earlier, mayapple. Mayapple is extremely toxic. The entire plant can kill you. But that fruit, when it's perfectly ripe or overripe, is one of the most divine tastes you'll ever taste in the woods in Ontario. Pawpaw trees, a native fruit tree. They're the largest fruit native to North America, the largest fruiting body native to North America. To the Eastern Woodlands, they can get about this big, which is large. from a fruit tree, like that big. The only thing that's bigger in the fruit world in North America is squash. Like really, when you look at that, that's a huge fruit. So those kinds of concepts come in from like throughout the year time. So fruit, shoots, barks, they're like the main ones. Certain roots, again, as we're talking about like the Cossack asparagus and the cattail shoots or the cattail roots, uh, and other roots right now are actually like shrinking. This is the worst time of year to try and pick sunchokes. You want to pick them either in the late fall or early spring because that's when they're storing energy because they're tubers. They're an energy storage device just like a potato. So you want to get them when they're storing the energy, not when they're using the energy to grow.
Did that answer your question, Ben, or was there?
Or did I just make it even more complicated?
Bro was just yapping. Um, yeah, no, you definitely answered the question. Is within all that talking though, I couldn't help but think about the one time that I was on a fast and I was so hungry and I felt so drawn to just dragging my bottom teeth along a freshly peeled tree fall.
Yes.
And you're saying there's like only particular times a year that it's like good. I think that time it wasn't good.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Freshly peeled white pine bark from like now until early July, late July. Well, mid July I would say is like the latest I would be peeling pine bark and chewing on it. Um, wouldn't peel it in April and I wouldn't peel it in August. I could tell you that. It's very bitter at that point and it's very sticky because at that point a lot of the sap has left the tree and now we're back to pitch, which is a whole other thing altogether about pines. They have that very sticky gum, just like spruce, but it's on the inside of the tree as well. Very resinous gum, resinous sap.
Yeah,
So
I believe it was August that I was dragging my teeth on a tree.
very
Maybe
bitter
I'll
that
bring
time of year.
some. I could probably bring some pine branches down for this weekend's live class, and we
Oh
could
heck yeah,
come up with food.
definitely.
Yeah, I could probably find some time to cut a couple
Yeah,
branches.
let's choose
Yeah,
some
drop off
trees.
here.
Let's choose some trees. Let's go back to our roots and our barks.
Awesome. Any other questions before we take? I think we'll maybe just take a little break, and then I've probably got a pretty short piece, so maybe like 20 minutes or something when we get back. We'll see how deep we go. Okay, well, yeah, why don't we take a 5-minute break and then we'll do, yeah, we're going to chat a little bit about the habitats and ecology of Turtle Island in the Eastern Woodlands when we get back. All right, so we're going to dive into part two. Yeah, probably won't be super long session here, but it really does start to build off of what Caleb was just sharing with us there. You know, and one of the things I'm starting to, I shouldn't say starting to, but one thing I really appreciate about learning about plants, learning about trees, learning about ecology, as our relationship starts to shift with the land, is understanding those patterns across the greater landscape. And you know, it's one thing. You know, I'll think about this for mushrooms. I'll give you an example. When I first started getting excited about harvesting wild mushrooms, I would just go out into the woods and wander around and be like, okay, where's there a mushroom? And then I'd find one and be like, oh, what is it? Can I eat this? You know, let's look it up. Can I ID it? And usually I'd end up with being in a place of like, oh, I think it's this, but I'm actually terrified to put it in my mouth because it might kill me. And over time, as my understanding of ecology has grown, I no longer just randomly walk around the woods looking for mushrooms, looking for plants, looking for bark. You know, I even think about my early days of bushcraft and survival. You know, I wasn't thinking about, you know, what is the best month of the year harvest bark. It was just like, oh, I want to make a birch bark basket. There's a birch tree. I'm going to go cut some off. And sometimes the bark would come off really nice. Other times it was really hard. And in my beginner mind, it was just like, I didn't connect the dots, you know? So part of the beauty of starting to deepen our understanding of ecology and our relationship with the land is actually realizing that there are cyclical and seasonal cycles to all these things that we can come back into balance with, which is really one of the big themes of this whole Survive-a-Rama Land Stewardship Guild program is what does it look like to come back into right relation with the seasonal cycles of the land and to do those tasks at the time of the year where they're in balance with what the ecosystem is doing and working with the ecology of the different areas. Um, so now, you know, I'll give you an example. Like we just kind of finished, maybe a couple of weeks ago was the end of morel season. Caleb mentioned that morel mushrooms, you know, are a real delicacy and one of the first foods that come out in the springtime. Interesting enough, you know, if you want to talk about extending your foraging season, mushrooms are some of the earliest and some of the latest things that we can still forage in abundance on the land. But morels, they're a they're a delicious mushroom if you've never had one before. They're relatively easy to identify and probably one of the safer ones to learn to forage. I mean, you do need to know what a false morel is and a few other tricks, but they're probably a fairly safer beginner mushroom to get into. But morels grow in very specific habitats. Up here where we grow, or up in the Muskoka area here, we often find black morels growing under disturbed soil around pine trees specifically. And I would say more specific, or more commonly though, you'll often find the blonde morels, black morels around in like ash forests, elm forests, around even old apple orchards, like they love old apple trees. So they're mycorrhizae fungi that are in relationship to very specific tree species, right? So if I want to go looking for morel mushrooms, I don't just wander through the woods randomly looking for a morel. I actually look for ash trees or I look for elm trees, right? If I want to harvest birch bark or basswood bark, I don't just randomly walk through the woods looking for a birch tree. I actually ask, well, what habitat does birch grow in? What habitat does basswood grow in? What habitat do wild strawberries, Ode'imin, grow in? Where do I find these in the first place? So then I can look at a map or look at the greater landscape and actually go right to the spot where I'm most likely to find that food or that thing that I want to gather in the first place. So that's what we're going to chat about a little bit today, is starting to pattern our brains on some of the habitats around here and the different species and communities that go with them. So I'm going to share a little slideshow here. Give me a second. So we're going to start off with a bit of a kind of bigger picture zoomed outlook. And then we're going to kind of zoom in as the talk goes on. So if I zoom way out, looking down at Turtle Island like an eagle up in the sky right now, you'll notice there's some big picture names on here, right? You go to the far north and we've got this thing called the Canadian Shield. So I personally live up on the Canadian Shield. Rama is actually a little bit south of the Canadian Shield. You're kind of right on the edge of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence lowlands, which is the alkaline soil, where it meets the granite rock to the north, and you're super, super close to that in-between spot there. But there's the granite shield in the middle, and then it drops down into the lowlands. We've got the Appalachian Mountains to the east, and we've got the Rockies to the far west. And then you've got like the Great Plains in the interior, and then you've got kind of the coastal plains and coastal rainforests, right? So this is kind of like real zoomed out big picture habitat. But with each one of those, you're going to find very, very specific communities that grow on a more micro level. And these things are impacted by stuff like geology. What is the rock type? So where I live, there's a fraction of the trees that grow here than where Caleb lives down in Hiawatha. Up here, there's way less trees for two reasons. Well, there's probably more than two, but two of the big ones that stand out. One is the soil type. We have very acidic soil up here because of the granite stone that is our bedrock. In the south, where Caleb is in Hiawatha and where you folks are down on Rama, you have alkaline soil because you're down in that Great Lakes St. Lawrence, kind of like that giant floodplain after the last ice age, right? The second one, of course, is climate. We just have so fewer growing days up here, just being that much further north and that higher in elevation, right? But things like geology, hydrology, local ecology, climate, all of these things are going to impact what grows from one area to the next. I'm going to kind of skip over some of this because it's a little beyond what we want to chat here. But if we were going to do some really broad groupings for like the major habitats of Turtle Island, we'll look at that first, and then we'll sink into our area, which we can kind of group as the Eastern Woodlands, and chat about the habitat zones of the Eastern Woodlands and where we might go to gather different foods, different barks, different materials. So of course, if you go to the very far north, that kind of dark purple color, you have what we call the tundra habitat, right? And then even up in the Taiga, sometimes it's called, like up around Hudson's Bay. And really, you've got next to no trees up in that area, very small shrubs, very short growing season, very interesting habitat. As you move further south, you get into that kind of the blue and I don't even know what you call that color, like kind of the number 5 there. You get into the boreal forest, which I'm sure most of you have heard of before, right? Boreal forest has fewer species than I have here, even on the granite shield, actually way fewer species. The boreal forest is, large swaths of spruce trees, birch trees, some poplar trees. There's very few actual species up there, right? And then you move down to the granite shield, where I'm at, just north of you folks. If you think about like Algonquin Park, and that whole kind of region up towards North Bay, right? You get these rolling hills, so we call that the granite shield. But the granite shield is part of this greater area we kind of call the Eastern Woodlands, which goes from kind of like 5 down into kind of 8 there, right? Then we have the prairies, and then we have the rainforests. So those are kind of like the major ecosystems of North America. But within our Great Lakes region here, our Eastern Woodlands, we actually have several different, like real micro ecosystems in here, right? I mentioned the Great Lakes St. Lawrence lowlands already, which is kind of where a lot of folks like that are on this call probably live. As you get further south, down into like far southern Ontario, like I think kind of like London south, and then down into the northern states, depending on where you are, down like towards like Michigan and, well, southern Michigan actually. Northern Michigan is actually more like it is here. You get into a way wider variety of species. Suddenly you've got things like tulip trees. Caleb mentioned pawpaw. There's all these different species, butternuts and all the hickories and things like that. These start to become Carolinian species, which we don't have up here on the Granite Shield. The land in between is kind of that buffer zone in between like the Granite Shield of the north and then the Carolinian species of the south, and it is this unique ecosystem. It's kind of like the crossover between like coyotes and wolves, coyotes to the south and wolves to the north, deer to the south and moose and elk to the north. I think about like the crossover of like southern flying squirrels into northern flying squirrels, right? It's this really, really special transition zone, the land in between. So let's really dial that in. That's just kind of like big picture, kind of zoomed out. It's a bit of a review to what some of you guys might remember from in school. But I want to get really specific into the microhabitats now of the Eastern Woodlands, the type of habitat that we're all hanging out in. And I want to introduce this by actually going through this idea of forest succession. We're going to start with an open field. So after a disturbance, whether it's a forest fire that's gone through, whether it's a giant flood, whether it's a human disturbance, whether it's a beaver dam that lets go and drains a pond, what does it look like in this habitat to go from that flat, open, disturbed area right through to a mature forest? And how might that look different depending on the microclimate? Is it a lowland? Is it, a ridge? Is it a valley? Is it up high? What's the soil like? So we're going to just do a little bit of a walkthrough. And I'd encourage you to give some thoughts to, the types of materials that we're learning about gathering inside of the Rama Land Stewardship program. We've talked a lot about working with bark. We're starting to get into foraging. We're starting to harvest materials for different bushcraft projects. So as we start to go through this, I want to jam a little bit on, which of these habitats would be the most appropriate to find different materials that you might be looking for. So after a major disturbance, of course, we have an open habitat. Often poor nutrients, although it can depend, a forest fire can actually leave a lot of nutrients on the ground. It really kind of depends on what the disturbance was. But we get these, what we call primary succession species. So if you look at some of these pictures right here, like that top left with those yellow flowers, a common one, the mullein plant. And what's interesting about a lot of these early succession species, one is they can often grow in habitats that don't have great soil to begin with, or compressed soil. And a lot of these plants actually have really long, big tap roots that can go down and break up compressed soil. And they have big, broad leaves that they lay down on the ground that actually helps to build the soil on the surface, right? Interesting enough, a lot of our invasives are non-natives, which some of these are that we're going to talk about tonight, do really well in these disturbed soils, right? If you have a mature, healthy forest, often the invasives don't do as well in there. It's actually those damaged ecosystems, or damage is maybe the wrong word. Those disturbed ecosystems is often where those invasives can take place. But yeah, things like, actually, I'll just go on to the next slide here. So let's look at a handful of the plants that start in that early succession, and then how that moves to what animals come in and birds, and then how that moves to what trees and shrubs come in, and then how that transitions to an older forest. So, we'll often get like families like in the dock family. We'll get things like burdock, like yellow dock, like primrose. All of those have edible roots. We're kind of past the prime harvest time for them. Like Caleb mentioned, you often want to harvest those roots in the very early spring. before they really put a lot of effort into leafing out, and especially before they start to flower. Because once a plant starts to flower and preparing its seed or its fruit, that's where all of the energy is going up into there. So the roots like actually can shrink a little bit. Some of them are still growing, but they're woodier. They're way more nutrient devoid. Early spring, if you catch them, they have a lot of vitality and energy. And then again in the fall, once the plant part starts to die back, fall time is a great time to go and collect roots again as well. But early succession includes lots of edible roots and tubers: yellow dock, dandelions, burdock, primrose, right? Things like asters. There's that whole family of asters, which we'll probably see lots of this weekend. So those are some of the earliest species that start to come out, along with different types of mosses and lichens. And then next you get all of the berries start to grow. Things like the wild strawberries, things like raspberries, things like blackberries, all those brambles, milkweed. Of course, we all know the importance of milkweed and monarch butterflies. And then you start getting some of those invasives that do really well in those disturbed things. Things like Japanese knotweed, like buckthorn, dog strangling vine, giant hogweed, right? We could actually add way more plants to that list, but these are giving you an idea of some like kind of disturbance or early succession plants. And with those early succession plants, there's communities of mammals and birds that really do well in these habitats. You know, I think about there's all kinds of field birds that do really well, but for example, there's some very specific sparrows that love that open habitat. Things like song sparrows, you know, chipping sparrows, field sparrows love that open habitat. Birds like bobolinks and meadowlarks and whippoorwills love that open habitat. Killdeers even, you know, they're a little bit more kind of water's edge, but still love those open habitats. There's specific types of hawks that really love the open habitat. And, you know, the classic one, Boedo, is a group of hawks. They're basically the hawks that have the really broad wings and tails that allow them to catch those wind currents. And you'll see them gliding over top of those fields, you know, hunting things like rodents, hunting smaller birds. So the red-tailed hawk is a great example of like, you know, something that loves that open field habitat, that early succession forest. Of course, mice and voles, groundhogs, coyotes, you know, are some of the mammals that start to use those. Now, the next thing that starts to happen is you get some young trees. Oh, I probably should have actually reversed these. The trees should probably, I should picture that arrow kind of going the other way. So you get all those early stage plants that come on, right? They start laying down their leaves every year. That starts building up the soil. Then the rodents come in, right? Because the rodents are literally eating those seeds, you know, from all those berries, you know. They're eating the seeds of the burdock. They're eating the seeds of all those different plants that are dropping there. And as they do that, they're spreading the seeds, as are the song sparrows, right? And then suddenly we start to have things like small shrubs pop up. Things like the pins and the choke cherries will start to pop up. We get those early succession trees, things like poplars, things like red pines, it's white birch, Scots pine, you know, will often get popping up around here in those early succession forests. And then once you get a little bit of that initial tree cover starting, it brings in a new group of mammals and a new group of birds. Suddenly the deer start moving in because they've got a little bit of cover, but they can still exploit the food sources of that open habitat. The cottontail rabbits start to show up. The squirrels start to show up. You know, the robins start to show up. The turkeys start to show up. So imagine now you've got this forest that, you know, maybe 5 years ago it was full of blackberries, it was full of strawberries, it was full of milkweed, and then suddenly the pin cherries and the birch are coming up. Now the birch are getting big enough, the poplars are getting big enough, and they're creating enough shade that all those berries start to die. The strawberries don't live there anymore. The blackberries kind of die there. And that understory starts to shift. And as that understory becomes less dense with all the brambles, suddenly those hardwood tree species that actually like to grow in the shade start to shift in. So this is when you start to see things like the white pines, the oaks, the maples, the beech, the basswood, the ash, the hemlock, the other nuts. Those seeds make their way into the understory where they're now a bit more shaded, there's a bit more moisture, and they can grow slowly in the shade of these other trees, waiting for those primary trees to die. And most of those primary trees I just mentioned, the white birch, the poplars, the jack pine, they all have very short lifespans relative to a tree. You know, usually you're talking like kind of 60 to 120 years that those trees will grow for, and then they'll just die all of a sudden. But when they die and the maple or the oak or the hemlock comes up in the understory, these primary species, or sorry, these climax tree species, they can actually live for hundreds of years. You can get hemlocks that are 600 years old, even more potentially. For sure, 300 years old. Anyways, so each one of these stages creates the conditions for the next. And then as our climax trees come in, you get the climax bird species. So suddenly we switch from red-tailed hawks. The red-tailed hawks are gone now. They're going over to the next forest fire, to the next field. And you get this whole group we call accipiters come in, the forest hawks, right? We get the forest birds, things like warblers, and there are warblers that like edge habitat and open habitat, but there's a lot of warblers that like that dense interior forest. Some of the thrushes, things like the hermit thrush and the wood thrush. We switch from being ideal deer habitat to better moose and elk habitat. We switch from coyote habitat into wolf habitat. We get into pine marten habitat, right? So the climate trees switch, and then so do the plants and birds. And then we start to get this whole new group of plants that are growing in the understory. And suddenly we get into things like the wild leeks or the ramps. We get into the trilliums. We get into the leatherwoods. We get into all these beautiful flowering plants, things like cohosh and blooming hearts. We get into things like hazelnuts growing in the understory, or hobblebush. We get striped maple. So there's, I guess the point I'm trying to share here is, with each kind of stage of succession, there's a plant community, there's a tree community, and then there's a mammal community and a bird community associated with it. So as you begin to learn about foraging, as you begin to learn about bushcraft, as you begin to learn about surviving, understanding, what stage of succession does this species grow in, and where might I find that on the landscape, or even hunting for that matter, right? If I want to go hunt moose, I'm going to look for different things maybe than I'm going to look for deer, right? So what type of characteristics am I looking in the habitat to now go find the species that I'm searching for? So I'm going to give you an example of some of the major communities that we have right around here. And this is specific to trees and the microhabitats that you might find. So for example, if I go down into the lowlands where the soil is wet, you often find things like black spruce, you find white cedar, you'll find balsam fir, silver maple, black ash, yellow birch, tamarack. All of these trees like to have their, or I shouldn't say, all of these trees do well with moist soil and with their roots a little bit wet. Now, some of these will also do okay up in dry areas, like, balsam fir will grow in drier areas, cedar will grow in drier areas. But generally, like black ash, tamarack, black spruce, silver maple, like they want wet feet and that kind of lowland habitat, right? And you'll notice some of these species cross over. But if I want to go find black spruce root to go and, we did made those baskets, the birch bark baskets a couple months back, the McCuck, and we used spruce root. If you want to go and harvest spruce root to make a McCuck, you would maybe want to go and look for some of those lowland habitats where you're going to find the black spruce growing in density, and where you've got that nice layer of peat moss, and those black spruce roots are really easy to dig out of the soil there, right? As we move out of the lowland habitats, we might get into little moist valleys or the edges of lake. And the difference here, a lowland is literally like the water table is really low. The roots are literally going to have a lot of moisture, at least for a chunk of the year. A moist valley might be, we're up higher off the ground, the water table is way deeper, but there's a hillside on each side and we get a little valley. And thus it's going to be moister at the bottom of the valley than it's going to be at the top of the hill, right? Or, for example, around along lake edges. Along the edges of the lake, you'll get moister soil than you will higher up the hillside, right? So in these valleys and edges, we often find things like hemlocks. Again, the balsam firs, red maple. We switch from the silver to the red maples. Instead of seeing the black spruce, you might start to see white spruce. The yellow birches are often still there. The red maple, oh yeah, I said that one already. Now, as we transition up the hillside, so we've gone from the lowland into kind of that edge of the valley. Now we're getting up into the mature hillside forests. And we talked about this during the Sugar Moon weekend that we spent together in Rama. And Caleb talked a lot about, how the maples actually help pull moisture into the soil in those areas. And those are very rich, lush soils, So those lush hillsides and uplands, that's when we get into the sugar maple, the beech, the white pines, the basswoods, the ironwoods or hop hornbeams, the white and the green ash, the white spruce again. For you folks further south, this is where we get into a lot of the different types of nut trees that grow down there. Rocky ridges, particularly here in Muskoka, where you in the northern part of this range, are rocky ridges are you often hemlock or cedar. Not a lot else will grow because there's limited soil in there, but the hemlocks and the cedars seem to love those rocky ridges. When you get up to the top of the hill, you'll often get these little pockets where there's rocky bedrock and really shallow soil. This is often when we get into like the red oaks and the bur oaks growing up in there. And then you get into the sandy flats, those open sandy areas. You often get into things like the red pines and the jack pines that are doing really, really well in here. So I'm probably missing some species in here, and some of these might belong in a couple of the other sections, but it gives you a bit of an idea how our different tree species associate with very micro kind of habitats here in the Eastern Woodlands. I'm going to pause there and say, Caleb, do you want to add anything to that?
Sorry, I was just trying to find my unmute button. Wasn't clicking off. No, this is a really good breakdown of the whole greater scheme of it all. It's really fascinating to me when you look at like it's often to do with like the water table, in my opinion. Like, of course, geology and everything else, but like when you have if you look at how water moves, it's always trying to go down to the lowest point. So when you have those like mid-hill valleys that's catching some of that water and keeping it there, the plants are going to have much shallower roots because they're working there. They also need to kind of be a little bit more aerated so they don't completely rot. Unlike like black ash or pumpkin ash, those species they can actually like just completely be submerged. But you'll find like a silver maple swamp. You'll never find a sugar maple swamp. And think of how wild that is when they're such closely related species. I find that to be like the fun part of it all is like white ash grow on hilltops and on hillsides. Black ash grow in the swamp. Silver maple grow in the swamplands and the shorelines. Sugar maples would be up on the very top of the hill if they have the choice.
And red maples in between the two.
Yeah, and then you have like white ash, it'll be up, black ash will be low. White oak are often the opposite. You find white oak often growing near water, red oak growing up on the hilltops. So I find that part of like the details can get really fascinating of like, okay, I know that my ancestors used X species for Y project. Where do I find that? And once you learn the ecology, it becomes almost like forecasting. Like I'll say to somebody, we'll go up into like, let's say Magnetowin. Not too far from Rama, but pretty far from me. It's about a 2.5, 3 hour drive from where I am, maybe a little bit more, to get to Magnetowin. And I'll say, oh, we need to get jack pine. Let's go over here. I bet it's over in this area because when we are driving by this area or hiking up into this area, I saw the X amount of like features, and I could just walk in and there's jack pine, and people are like, "You're a wilderness Jedi." It's like, no, I've learned to read the signs, and when you learn to read those signs, it's that old phrase of you can't see the forest because of the trees. Once you learn how to identify the trees at distance, like you can look over forest. We talked about this in the sugar bush. If I'm looking for a new sugar bush because we got driven out of our traditional one, it got damaged, it got destroyed, or we just can't go back to that area for whatever reason, we depleted all the firewood, whatever it may be, I'll get up on top of those ridges, and yeah, all the deciduous trees look the same in wintertime from a distance because they're all just a bunch of dead branches, dead. But I can tell a hemlock from a pine. And if I can tell where the hemlocks are, that's the type of ecology I'm expecting to find red maples and up the little ridge from them or up the hill a little bit from them, sugar maple. It's that kind of like forecasting that I find to be almost like tracking the trees, right? It's like reading nature's language. It's not just bird language, not just tracking, it's all of it. Once you learn ecology, that's like the secret like enigma code to get to understanding the ecology. It's like once you understand the ecology and the tree identification, you know where to look for what. And you almost 9 times out of 10, you're bang on the money once you get used to it. Once you understand the system, it becomes really, really easy. It feels easy to us at least because we've been doing it for at least 20 years each. But it's not hard to learn. It just takes time to practice it. The code is pretty much as simple as Chris laid out. The ecology dictates the species. And the ecology is dictated by the geology, which also includes the water formation or the water table of the area. What Chris was talking about with the acidic soil where he is, because he's on granite, that granite is fairly neutral to acidic itself, but then it's growing all these coniferous trees that are producing pine needles and spruce needles that are building up a humus that then leaches acidic compounds into the soil. I live on limestone. Limestone is lime. Lime is base. This is the most alkaline soil. The land between us, like literally between Chris and I, is referred to in the geologic formation as the land between for a reason. You have this smashing of the Canadian Shield with the limestone formations. And because of that, you get this crazy biodiversity. I'm on the southern cusp of the land between. Rama is on like the northern edge near Wissahickon. The Rama is about the northern edge of the land between. In my neighborhood, I have black locusts growing beside tamaracks, not even like American larch, tamaracks, like swamp tamarack. I have black spruce growing beside bladdernuts. I have butternuts growing beside white pines. It's this wild smash up. And when you have the tree diversity of that, or the tree ecology, the birds, the animals, all of it makes sense. We see moose where I live, but we have a ton of white-tailed deer. We see coyote. We also see wolf, and we see a lot of coy wolf hybridization in this region. This is one of the heavier areas for coy wolf hybridization, is that land between. Further north in Ontario, the more wolf in the genes. Further south, the more coyote. Here, right in the middle. So it's that kind of like, it's a secret code that's not that secret. And so like we watch this session when it goes live on our on the Rama Survive-a-Rama YouTube channel. Watch it and watch it again and really pay attention to that ecological key that Chris was giving you, because that was the key to the code. And once you get the key, you can read the code. And once you read the code, you can practice it. And now you can speak it. And you can find it and forecast and turn it into a game of, I think I will find these species here. Go over, confirm your hypothesis. That's how science works. You prove your hypothesis or disprove the hypothesis. So I think that's the only thing I can really add to that.
Awesome. Maybe just the one layer I'll add there too is when we think about stewardship. So Ben started this whole organization as the Rama Land Stewardship Guild with the intention, as how do we become caretakers of the land again, right? So as we're going out to forage, as we're going out to collect bark, to make things, how are we actually giving back and supporting healthy ecologies, right? And to be able to actually give back to the land, we need to understand what a healthy ecosystem looks like in the first place. And the area that we're actually meeting at for our in-person sessions is a very disturbed ecosystem. Although there's some pretty awesome news. For those of you that were at the live session last week, Caleb thinking there may be some ash showing some potential resistance to ash borer, which is amazing. But that forest there is definitely a disturbed early succession forest that has a number of invasives coming in. And I think, there's a lot that we could actually do to help it become more biodiverse quickly, provide for things like foraging opportunities, better hunting opportunities, better collecting of all kinds of materials for us as humans interacting with that land, but also for the wildlife as well. And something we'd really like to do with the future of this Land Stewardship Guild is get into actually tending those forests while we're out there, figuring out what is there and what is it missing. And maybe we can start planting things that are missing. Or maybe we can actually go and collect and harvest and take from the land in a way that makes the habitat better for the species we want to invite in there, so they perform better there. And that's something we're going to be exploring as we go deeper in these in-person sessions. In-person session is this weekend, so hopefully some of you will come join us. It is the June, what is it? 8, just looking at the date here. What's the date this weekend? 18th,
It's
19th?
21, 22.
Yeah, June 21, 22, 9:30 a.m. So we would love to have you out. We're going to be working with bark. We're going to be making glue from spruce gum. We're going to be making some birch oil. We're going to do some really cool stuff. So hopefully some of you will consider coming. And I'm going to pass it. It looks like Caleb's got one other thing he wants to jump in with before we call it a night here.
Oh, the one thing I was going to add on, it's kind of unimportant now, but basically the fact that you can remove species and it's benefiting the ecology, but you can also, in a sense, harm species and benefit the ecology. The cutting down of trees, people are often saying like, hey, we should be reducing deforestation. Deforestation leads to succession. Deforestation, to an extent, when we're talking, we could be talking about defoliation, just removing branches from a tree, pruning trees back to allow other trees to grow better, or to prune off problematic branches that are going to lead to issues for a species, for a tree species, or an individual, or dropping a tree allows the soil microbes a new food source to start being able to colonize and create new fungi that will benefit other species. Don't think that it has to be this pristine wilderness that has to be perfectly clean and devoid of death. Death is what creates life. We are omnivores. We kill everything to sustain our lives, and so do a lot of other things, including plants and animals and fungi. So it's mostly just saying, like Chris is talking about, removal in a good way. It's removal in a good way, whether it's removing an invasive species or removing a problematic tree in one spot to benefit more things. Opening the canopy in the cedar bush that we were in for the last live session. We went to the cedar bush. That's a really dank, dark, shaded out area because of the cedar trees. Remove, as little as 5% of those cedars. Suddenly there's a whole lot more sun on the forest floor, and those other species of trees who have seeds in there have been waiting can come up and emerge. That's really it. Just like nothing's bad. We're just talking about everything in total.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for everyone for joining in with us this evening. Hopefully we'll see some of you in person this weekend. And for those of you watching the replay, I hope you found some value in it. Good night, Mama P.
Mama P.
Take care, Desiree.